The swamps began before the road ended, a slow green flood of cattails and cypress shouldering against the last dry rise of earth. Spanish moss trailed from the live oaks like funeral cloth, and the air tasted of iron and old rain. Locals called the ruin Angel's Rest, as if a weary seraph might fold its wings there and sleep. But the brickwork had long since bowed, and the bell cradle up in the cupola hung empty, and when the marsh wind moved through the broken windows, it sounded like breath drawn in pain. The records, when they were finally found in 1923, worm-eaten ledgers locked inside a mildewed chest behind the altar, were written in a hand so precise it felt like a rebuke. Dates, measurements, names, prices, weather. The entries began in 1789. They ended abruptly in 1808. Between, there were numbers that kept appearing like a refrain. Arrivals, interrogations, dispositions. The men who unlatched that chest shut it again very carefully, as if they'd opened a grave and seen the dead had been busy with accounts. Years earlier, before the chapel roof buckled and the palmetto pushed through its floor, the Whitworth family stood on the veranda of their new-built house and looked over rice the color of coins. Gabriel Whitworth liked to stand with his hands on the rail and let the fields explain his power back to him. He had silver in his hair, though he was barely past 40, and he carried himself with the hush of a man confident he could still a room with one raised finger. He had been born among tobacco and loss, and learned early that ruin was simply a door you stepped through if you had the nerve to see the other side. Constance, his wife, floated where he strode. She moved as if every step might bruise the earth. Her dark hair was arranged exactly so. The hands that smoothed her gown never blistered, never bled. There was a remove in her gaze, a room where she had exiled her horror and locked the door. The children were arranged like instruments in an orchestra, each trained for a sound. Ezekiel, tall, immaculate, eyes that never warmed, learned the ledgers and the mathematics of pain. Miriam learned the art of welcome, the hour when the light in the chapel's window fell like safety, the tone a frightened woman needed to hear to take one more step. Cain learned doors and irons and the way a body fought itself when it understood it was trapped. Abel learned questions and how to set them in a mouth that smiled. Lilith learned to be no more than a girl and less than a threat, to ask if the traveler wanted water, to wrap a shawl around a child and murmur good news. Michael the brother ran the fields. Raphael, the other brother, who called himself Seraph, ran the work that lived below the floorboards. It was all arranged with care. The chapel stood half a mile from the big house. Gabriel insisted on that. The path between wound beneath oaks thick with moss, and the moss was deliberate too. Sound could be caught in it and never escape. The chapel itself offered nothing to alarm the devout. Clear glass where it faced the road, colored glass where it faced the marsh, a painting of Michael's triumphant sword over the altar to set the mind on judgment. The door in the altar was a perfection of carpentry. The stairs behind it were black and cool. Down there the air never changed and the candles burned without wavering. They called their project an order, a fraternity of fallen angels that would lift the most desperate souls out of their sins. Word traveled along quarters and kitchen steps and whispered markets. There was a sanctuary where a man could find bread and direction, where a mother could bring her child and be shown how to cross into a life where nobody owned her name. Passwords, guiding stars, the safe bend in the river described so precisely you could see it before you arrived. People came at dusk and in rain, their shoes mud to the ankles and their shoulders afire with fear, and the first face they saw was Miriam's. "Rest yourself," she would say with that near smile that meant sisterhood. "You're not the first and you won't be the last." In the morning, Gabriel would pray over them. He was all justice then, and tears shone in eyes hungry to believe. He spoke of deliverance and burdens lifted and the narrow path. The prayer was always long enough to be a binding. By nightfall, the family knew what each traveler knew, which cousin had promised to follow, where a ferryman would not ask questions, which quarters housed a man with the gift of maps in his head. The next night brought the cells. Seraph did not hurry. He could make pain behave like a civil tutor. He knew what a wrist could endure when bound tight against a beam, and how long a throat could scream before it tore. He knew how to draw fear out drop by drop as if it were a tincture. Abel wrote in a fine hand while Cain minded the doors and Miriam sang to children in the hall. Gabriel visited sometimes and laid a hand on a brow and asked gently whether the Lord had revealed any names. Afterwards, readied for transport, The bodies rode riverward in crates made to fit them. Forms were signed. Physicians nodded. The money arrived on time. They did not get careless. They paid for their respectability with the coins of deference and charity. They were seen at church. Gabriel offered a lay sermon now and again that could squeeze tears from men who would later hang a boy for stealing a knife. The enslaved on their rice lands ate better than most and buried their dead with a preacher. This was not mercy. It was camouflage. Storms came in 91, heavy and frequent, flattening crops and raising desperation like a fever. 43 souls stepped into Angel's Rest that October alone. Efficiency grew teeth. Ezekiel devised categories. Young men with good arms and eyes that understood woods were worth keeping 3 days. Mothers worth 2. Old men and the broken, 1 night for decency's sake. The ledgers added their straight black strokes. The pattern bloomed beyond the county like mold. A doctor in Charleston knew which ink to use on which certificate. A captain on the Ashley knew which crates not to question as long as they were well roped. A minister in a neighboring circuit rode out to bury a fever victim he had never seen alive, and coughed meaningfully when anyone asked why the coffin was shut. Far to the north, a Quaker named Jeremiah Morrison began to notice how often letters home ended with a name that never arrived. He was a careful listener. He turned stories into maps and maps into questions. The questions led him to a man who would step onto a road alone and lie beautifully if it meant others might live. Samuel Washington was quick in mind and slower in speech, with a face the sun had turned uncertain between white and brown. Papers said he was owned. His posture said otherwise. He walked into Charleston in March of 99 and worked until he had a story. It did not take long for the story to bring an address. Angel's Rest looked exactly how hope should look when a man is out of it. The woman at the door had a voice meant for lullabies. The first bowl of food always came hot. The second night, Washington lay awake and listened, and the wall breathed. Not the wind, not rats. Human breath choked and lengthened and broke. He did not sleep again. By the third day, he had the outlines, the path from the altar, the habit of the brothers, the way the keys changed hands. He was not careful enough. Abel watched him watch. The pistol was almost a kindness. Back to bed? Abel murmured and smiled as if at a joke they shared. Down below it smelled of lie and time. Cells lined the stone like beads. Washington greeted the whispering voices and gave them pieces of courage to put in their mouths in place of bread. Serif laid out his instruments as if preparing for a lesson. He asked questions the way a harpist plays arpeggios. Washington answered with half-truths wrapped around lies. He bled and kept choosing. The first mercy came in the shape of a girl with a tray, a knot of hair slipping from its ribbon. Grace was 13 and had been taught to keep her eyes on the floor, but they climbed anyway, first to the bars, then to the man who thanked her like she had saved him. Washington asked for her name like a prayer. He spoke quietly in a language nobody else in that house valued, the language of doubt. It took. She left a lock turned. Mercy, Grace's twin, was sharper. She made a sound like a bird when she saw what her sister had done, and Michael came with a fist and a rope and a tremor in his jaw. The next day, Washington could not lift his head. He had one plan left. If he could not walk out, he could hold their attention long enough for the men gathering in fog along the river to break the door. The fire began in a drying shed. Sparks stung the dark like insects. Men ran. Morrison's small band, Quakers and free black dockmen and one white sailor with a scar that bit into his smile, moved through the chapel with guns kept low and voices kept lower. The altar door, when they found it, opened on the first try. They walked into a room where someone had calculated the weight of a scream. They counted 11 living. In the next chamber they counted ledgers. Numbers were everywhere. They thought they had half an hour. It turned out to be less. Smoke curled under the chapel rafters and lay in the corners like a waiting cat. Washington insisted, even half-conscious, on the papers. The ledgers, and the letters with their agreeable phrases about redemption that, read the right way, spelled roads and names and prices. The journal Serif kept with dates and weights and careful observations about the way a body fails. Morrison loaded his arms until the strap of his bag cut his shoulder. They carried who they could and stumbled for the trees. Behind them, the bell-less tower swallowed fire and offered nothing back. Downriver, a boat took cargo it had not expected, people who were breathing, and pages. Justice did not follow like thunder. It came in fits and starts, in rooms with shutters closed against August and in winter parlors dressed for Christmas. In Charleston, the men at the desk smiled ruefully and placed the papers under other papers. In Columbia, a magistrate who had once borrowed money from Gabriel put his hand on Morrison's shoulder and said the word, "unfortunate," as if it excused an ocean of blood. The Methodists found the scandal inhospitable to tithing. The family fled west while doors still opened for them. New Seraphim rose near Mobile, larger, better ventilated below, more convincing above. Gabriel acquired a license for the trade that had been his shadow all along. Bodies went north in barrels with proper seals. Living men and women went inland to plantations where the sky itself seemed unbroken. The order sent out new whispers. They added other businesses, an iron shop, a boat, a gentleman's practice of medicine, so that their lives would look like a handful of honest coins mixed with one dark jewel. Washington healed enough to stand, then to speak. He did not sleep often, but when he did, his hands clawed cypress bark. Morrison learned New Orleans registers and the names of professors who preferred questions unasked. In 1807, with men willing to die for the chance to stop more dying, they walked into Alabama disguised as what the world expected them to be. They smiled when Gabriel smiled and admired his neat solutions to the problem of profit versus conscience. They wrote down the dates of a society gathering that would bring cockroaches to the same breadcrumb at dawn. The meeting at New Seraphim was a dance of piety and arithmetic. Sermons about predestination in the great room. In the smaller rooms, the counting. Doctors, planters, a preacher who had learned not to flinch at his own reflection. They used the word redemption the way a butcher uses his thumb on the scale. Seraph lectured as if to students, his thin finger tapping diagrams that made cruelty look like a theorem. Gabriel dreamed out loud about scale, about factories for souls. On a cold January morning, fog lay so thick you could tuck it into your coat. Men moved among the trees in twos and threes. Warrants rode in jacket linings. Washington went for the office with its locked drawers. Morrison took the chapel. The first strike was the door downstairs, and then the sound the freed make when they breathe a room with a ceiling high enough for hope. The second strike was the drawer that stuck and then opened and then offered up a book with a black leather cover and neat, compulsive entries that matched the dead the way a man's signature matches his name. They seized men whose hands had held hymnals and ropes. They found maps marked with stars beside river bends and churchyards. They found letters that crossed state lines like bridges. They found jars. What they could not find was enough cooperation inside the law to hold the whole bloody skein. Trials 8 years. Witnesses vanished or came to court with eyes that would not meet the bench and stories that had been tidied overnight. Alabama's officials defended their own. The federal men said territory was not the same as state, and jurisdiction was a word with 1,000 teeth. Gabriel cornered, grew verbose. If not proud, then something kin to it. He had arranged his mind so thoroughly that he could explain his murders with scripture and believe himself devout. In 1811, he climbed the steps they built for him and met the height with calm. The rope did not make a believer of him. The rest of the family blurred into rumor. Seraph slipped south with a case of papers and a physician's cold tools. In Texas, someone later whispered about a ghost doctor with pale eyes and a love of a shriek. Ezekiel and the twins wore other names and opened other ledgers. Miriam and Lilith took a boat downriver and were said to run a house where powerful men were welcomed warmly and disappeared neatly. Constance died with silence on her tongue. Grace grew up with a truth she could never lay down. What the abolitionists carried out of those rooms changed other rooms. Roots shifted like rivers after a flood. Houses that had once been safe traded doors with other houses. Preachers who had never doubted now spoke of sin with their voices shaking. In northern cities where pews had grown comfortable, some people finally understood that a sermon could be a mask. Morrison kept working until the dark he had catalogued pressed on him too long and too hard. He died younger than his wisdom deserved. Washington found a pulpit of his own and carried his scars like scripture to people who needed to see. The big house near Mobile fell to weeds. The chapel burned, and still the space beneath it remained, a negative of rooms, a rumor in earth. Summer swallowed it first, then storm, then the way the living prefer their roads clean. No plaque. No bell. What survives are numbers that were meant to impress only their author, and paradoxically, preserved his guilt. Entries that add up to a toll that cannot be borne by a single page. What survives are stories spoken low about a family that found a way to make murder ordinary and profitable and palatable to men who shook hands in church and ate roast on Sundays. What survives is the lesson that a doctrine, any doctrine, can be twisted to hold a blade, that a ledger can be a weapon as surely as a whip, that respectability can be manufactured like rope, and yet the other thing survives too. A girl's unlocked latch, a man who bled and pretended and minded a clock made of pain, another man who carried paper like a weapon and held on when doors shut, hands that broke a door in a church so people could walk into air. There is no monument on that rise of earth where the moss still stoops to drink the heat, but if there were, it would have to be heavy enough to weigh two truths at once. That people will do anything and call it holy. That other people will risk everything to say it is not. If you stand near where the bell once hung, you can hear the marsh talk. It speaks a language older than justice and later than grief. It says the names that were taken and the names that were changed, the names that never made it into any ledger. It says be wary of the man who believes his cruelty is righteous. It says count, not only bodies but choices, and do not mistake good manners for goodness. It says listen for the latch. It says open the door.